I always thought my life was pretty normal. You know, the kind of routine that most people fall into. Work, family, a close-knit group of friends. I married Lisa when I was 27, and by the time I turned 32, we had a beautiful daughter, Emily, who had just turned 4. I worked a regular 9 to 5 at a tech firm, and Lisa managed the household while working part-time from home. Our life wasn't perfect, but we were comfortable, or so I thought. We had a group of friends we hung out with regularly, and 2 of them, Jason and Mark, were as close to me as brothers. We'd known each other since high school, and even after getting married and starting families of our own, we kept our tradition of hanging out every weekend. Whether it was catching a football game at the bar or having a BBQ in someone's backyard, the 3 of us were inseparable. At some point, though, I noticed Lisa becoming more social with Jason and Mark. At first, it was nothing unusual. She would laugh at their jokes, share stories with them, and sometimes even join in on our guys' nights when we had them at home. I figured it was great that my wife got along so well with my best friends. How many people could say that? But as time went on, things started to feel off. Lisa began texting them more often than I was comfortable with, and I'd catch them whispering or exchanging glances during our get-togethers. It wasn't like I thought anything was happening, but it did make me feel uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was paranoia. After all, these were my best friends, and Lisa was my wife. What could possibly be wrong? One night, after a BBQ at Jason's house, I came home with Emily while Lisa stayed behind. She said she wanted to help clean up and chat for a bit. I didn't think much of it, trusting her implicitly. I took Emily to bed, sat down to watch some TV, and eventually dozed off on the couch. Hours passed, and when I woke up, Lisa still hadn't come home. I checked my phone. Nothing. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. My stomach tightened. Something felt wrong. I called Jason, and after a couple of rings, he picked up. His voice was groggy, like he had just woken up. "Hey, man," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Is Lisa still there?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by an awkward cough. No, she left a while ago. I thought she went home." I hung up, feeling a surge of panic rise in my chest. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but a nagging feeling gnawed at me. I decided to drive back to Jason's house. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I had to know. When I arrived, I saw Lisa's car parked in Jason's driveway. My heart pounded as I approached the door. I knocked once, then twice. No answer. I didn't think twice before trying the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I stepped inside, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. There, on the couch, were Lisa, Jason, and Mark, together. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't something I could explain away. My wife had been sleeping with not one, but both of my best friends. The air felt heavy, like it was being sucked out of the room, and I stood there, frozen in place. They didn't notice me at first, too wrapped up in their moment. But when they finally saw me, their faces went pale. Lisa scrambled to cover herself, Jason and Mark stammering, trying to come up with excuses, explanations, anything. But there was nothing they could say that would change the fact that everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my friends, my life, had just shattered in front of me. I turned around without a word, walked out the door, and drove home in a daze. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, but all I could think about was Emily. How would I explain any of this to her? How was I supposed to move forward? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, one thing became clear. My life as I knew it was over. But instead of feeling anger, I felt something strange. Numbness. The numbness that settled over me after that night became my constant companion. I didn't feel rage, sadness, or even betrayal. Just an overwhelming emptiness. The next morning, Lisa came home like nothing had happened. She looked nervous, unsure of how to approach me, but I couldn't even bring myself to talk about what I had seen. It felt like a dream, or rather, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. But reality hit hard. I had to act. I couldn't just pretend things were normal, not with the weight of what had happened sitting between us like a wall. I couldn't look at her without seeing that scene on the couch, without hearing Jason's voice lying to me over the phone. It made my skin crawl. That afternoon, while Emily played in the backyard, I sat Lisa down in the living room. She already knew what was coming, but her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she fidgeted with her wedding ring. "Jack, she started, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said quietly, my voice steady but cold. "I don't want to hear it." Her mouth snapped shut, tears brimming in her eyes. Part of me wondered if she was truly sorry or just sorry that she had been caught. I didn't know anymore. The trust between us had been completely shattered, and no amount of crying could fix that. "We're done," I said, my words hanging heavy in the air. "There's no coming back from this, Lisa." She looked like she wanted to argue, to explain herself. but all she could do was nod. The weight of the silence between us was unbearable, but I didn't break it. I had made up my mind, and there was no point dragging it out. "What about Emily?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. That was the part that hurt the most. My daughter was the only thing tying me to this wreckage of a marriage. I loved her more than anything in the world, but I knew that staying in this house, in this life, was not an option. I wasn't going to pretend things were fine for her sake. She deserved better than to grow up in a home filled with lies. "We'll work something out," I said, my voice hardening. "I'm not going to be one of those dads who disappears, but I can't stay here." Lisa broke down in tears, her sobs echoing through the house, but I stood up and walked out. I couldn't sit there and watch her fall apart, not when I felt so disconnected from everything. I packed a small bag, just enough for a few days, and left the house without looking back. I needed space, time to think, time to breathe. I didn't know where to go at first, but something pulled me toward Jason's house. Strange, right? The man who had betrayed me was the one I felt drawn to. But in that moment, I didn't feel anger toward him, just a strange desire for answers. And maybe, in some twisted way, I wanted to see if there was any part of our friendship left. When I pulled into his driveway, Jason was already waiting outside, sitting on the front steps, as if he knew I'd come. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept. Good, I thought. He shouldn't be sleeping after what he'd done. "Jack," he said quietly as I stepped out of the car. "I'm sorry, I don't know how—" "Stop," I said, holding up my hand. I wasn't here for apologies. I just wanted to understand. "Why?" Jason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if he were searching for words. "I wish I had an answer that made sense, man. I wish I could tell you it was just a stupid mistake. But the truth is, it just happened. One night after you left early, we were drinking, talking, and one thing led to another." I clenched my jaw, the numbness in my chest threatening to give way to anger. "Both of you? You and Mark? At the same time?" Jason looked away, shame written all over his face. "Yeah, I don't know how it got to that point. It was never planned, never talked about. It just spiraled out of control." I stared at him for a long time, waiting for the anger to bubble up, for the fight that should have come naturally when you find out your wife's been cheating with your two closest friends. But instead I felt nothing. No rage, no sadness, just a strange, twisted sense of relief. "Well," I said, my voice cold, "congratulations, you got what you wanted. My marriage is over." Jason winced, but I didn't give him a chance to respond. Instead, I turned back toward my car, ready to leave, but then I hesitated. Something inside me, something buried deep, stopped me from cutting him off completely. "You know what's funny?" I asked, looking back at him. "I should hate you right now. I should never want to see your face again." Jason stood there, waiting for the inevitable blow. "But I don't hate you," I continued. "In fact, I don't feel anything." He opened his mouth, probably to apologize again, but I cut him off. "Don't apologize. Don't pretend this didn't happen. But if you want to talk, really talk, we can figure it out." Jason's eyes widened in surprise, but he nodded. "Yeah, man, I do. I really do." I left without saying another word, but as I drove away, something strange settled in my mind. I didn't feel as betrayed by Jason and Mark as I thought I would. The anger I should have felt wasn't there, and I wasn't sure why, but I knew one thing. I wasn't done with them. Not yet. I didn't go back home that night. Instead, I checked into a small hotel just outside of town. It wasn't much, just a place to crash while I figured out what the hell I was going to do next. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind a tangled mess. I had just left my wife, my daughter, and my entire life behind. But the emotions I expected to feel, rage, heartbreak, grief, still weren't there. The only thing that lingered was this odd numbness, like I was watching everything from a distance, too far away to truly connect with it. I kept replaying the conversation with Jason over and over again in my mind. The way he stood there, awkward and ashamed, expecting me to lash out or break down. I knew I should have been furious with him, and with Mark too, but I couldn't muster the energy. Maybe it was because part of me knew my marriage had been in trouble long before that night. Maybe I was just too drained to care anymore. Either way, I felt weirdly indifferent toward them. But one thing I knew for sure, I wasn't going to let this destroy me. The next morning, I made a decision. Instead of wallowing in the mess that had become my life, I reached out to Mark. If I could have a civil conversation with Jason, then I could at least try to get some answers from Mark too. Mark was less charismatic than Jason, more the quiet, introspective type. He wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to get wrapped up in something like this, which made his involvement even harder to understand. I called him up and told him I wanted to meet. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, but eventually, he agreed. We met at a coffee shop on the other side of town, somewhere away from the usual places we hung out. When I walked in, Mark was already sitting at a small table near the back, his face pale, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He didn't even look up as I approached. "Hey," I said, sitting down across from him. Mark glanced up, his face a mix of guilt and regret. "Jack, I don't even know where to start." "Start with why," I said simply, leaning back in my chair. "Why the hell did you do it?" He swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he fiddled with the cup in front of him. "It's not an excuse, but I got caught up in it. Jason and we were both drunk, and Lisa was, I don't know, man, she was just there. One thing led to another, and I wasn't thinking." "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "That's pretty obvious." Mark looked up at me, his eyes filled with shame. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jack. You're one of my best friends. It was the biggest mistake of my life." I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge if he really meant it. I could see the guilt in his eyes, and part of me believed him, but another part of me didn't care whether he was sorry or not. What was done was done. "I've already talked to Jason," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not looking for apologies. I just want to understand." Mark sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "There's no excuse, man. I don't know what I was thinking. It just happened." I stared at him for a long moment, the numbness still lingering in the back of my mind. This whole situation felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else, not me. But there was something else too, something unexpected. Sitting there with Mark, I realized I didn't feel the anger I thought I would. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying had been lifted. "I'm not going to hate you for this," I said finally, my voice calm. "I should, but I don't." Mark blinked, clearly taken aback. I don't understand. After what we did, after what I did, how can you not hate me?" I shrugged, still trying to make sense of it myself. Maybe because I've been checked out of my marriage for a while. Maybe because I've realized that this thing between you, Jason, and Lisa, it's not entirely about me. It's about choices you made that have nothing to do with my worth or what I did wrong. I could keep being angry, but what's the point? Mark just stared at me, speechless. I could see he was still grappling with the situation, and I wasn't sure if I was making things easier for him or harder. Either way, I felt more in control than I had in weeks. I was letting go, piece by piece. After a long silence, I spoke again. "I'm done with Lisa. The marriage is over, and I'm moving on. But I'm not done with you and Jason. I don't want to lose the two people who have been in my life the longest, just because of one huge screw-up." Mark's eyes widened in surprise. You still want to be friends? After all of this?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's weird, but yeah. I'm not saying things will go back to how they were, but I don't see the point in throwing everything away." Mark looked like he was going to cry, his shoulders slumping in relief. "I don't know how to thank you, Jack. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "I'm not saying I forgive you," I said, cutting him off. "Not yet. But we can work on rebuilding things if you're willing." Mark nodded quickly. "I am. I really am." We sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. It felt strange, but oddly enough, it also felt right. Like I was reclaiming a part of my life that had been on shaky ground for far too long. Later that night, as I lay in the hotel room, I realized something important. I didn't need Lisa, and I didn't need to be weighed down by the betrayal. I had already started the process of moving on, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control. But what came next was something I hadn't expected at all. The idea of a fresh start, not just with my friends, but with someone new. After that meeting with Mark, things began to shift. I never thought it would be possible, but in some strange way, my relationships with both Jason and Mark started to improve. I wasn't naive enough to think that what happened would just disappear, but somehow, facing the betrayal head-on, talking about it openly, made it easier to move forward. We didn't brush it under the rug. We acknowledged it, owned up to it, and then started working on the pieces that were still left. Jason and I met up a few days after my conversation with Mark. We grabbed a couple of beers at the same bar we used to hang out at before everything went to hell. It felt surreal, sitting across from him like old times, but this time with the unspoken weight of what had happened hanging over us. Still, I realized pretty quickly that the more we talked, the more that weight began to lift. "I still can't believe you're even talking to me," Jason said, shaking his head. "I thought for sure you'd never want to see my face again." I took a sip of my beer, then shrugged. "Yeah, I thought so too, but after everything, I've come to realize I need to move on. Holding on to that anger isn't going to fix anything. And honestly, it's more exhausting than just letting go." Jason looked at me with something close to disbelief. I don't get how you can be so calm about this. I laughed bitterly. I'm not as calm as I look, trust me. But I've had a lot of time to think since that night. I realized my marriage with Lisa wasn't perfect for a long time. Maybe what happened with you and Mark was just the final nail in the coffin. Jason nodded, the guilt still lingering on his face. For what it's worth, man, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I want to do whatever I can to make things right. I leaned back in my chair, staring down at the beer bottle in my hand. We can't go back, but we can figure out how to go forward. That night was the first time I felt a real sense of closure with Jason. We didn't hash everything out in detail, and I didn't expect him to grovel forever, but we both knew that something had changed. We weren't going back to the way things were, but we could still be friends. Better friends, even. The openness between us, the raw honesty, was something we'd never had before. And I realized that I valued that more than the polished version of friendship we used to have. The same went for Mark. Over the next few weeks, the three of us started hanging out again, though things felt different, of course. We talked more openly about our feelings, our screw-ups, and what we wanted from life. There was no more pretending. If we were going to move forward, it was going to be real, without the masks we used to wear. But while I was working on rebuilding my friendships, my thoughts kept drifting to the idea of starting fresh in other areas of my life, particularly in my love life. It was strange how quickly my mind turned toward the possibility of meeting someone new, given everything that had just happened. But the truth was, I felt free. The baggage of my failed marriage was behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could move forward without being tied down by guilt or obligation. I wasn't actively looking for anything serious, but I started going out more, meeting new people. It felt good to be out in the world again, not weighed down by the pressure of keeping up appearances or pretending everything was fine. And then one night, I met her. Her name was Sophie. We crossed paths at a mutual friends party, a casual get-together with people I hadn't seen in years. I wasn't expecting anything to come of it, but when I saw her standing across the room, laughing at something someone had said, I couldn't take my eyes off her. There was something magnetic about her, a kind of effortless confidence that drew me in. I wasn't even sure if I was ready for anything serious, but I figured there was no harm in introducing myself. So I walked over, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm Jack." Sophie turned to me, her eyes lighting up as she smiled. "Sophie," she replied, extending her hand. "Nice to meet you, Jack." We fell into easy conversation, and before I knew it, hours had passed. I learned that she worked in marketing, loved hiking on weekends, and had a dry sense of humor that kept me laughing the entire night. It felt so natural, so different from what I'd been through with Lisa. With Sophie, there were no heavy secrets, no emotional baggage, just two people connecting, plain and simple. As the night went on, I found myself opening up to her more than I expected. I told her about my recent divorce, about how everything had fallen apart with Lisa. She listened, nodding sympathetically, but there was no pity in her eyes, just understanding. She told me about her own past relationships, how she'd been through her share of heartbreaks but had come out the other side stronger. When the night finally came to an end, I realized I didn't want it to. For the first time since my marriage had ended, I felt something stir inside me, something new, something hopeful. We exchanged numbers, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement as I walked back to my car. It wasn't just about Sophie, though she was definitely a part of it. It was the realization that I could move on, that life after betrayal didn't have to be defined by pain and anger. I could rebuild, and I could find happiness again. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and I kept in touch. We went on a few dates, dinners, hikes, movie nights, and every time I was with her, I felt lighter. It was like the weight of everything that had happened with Lisa, Jason, and Mark was starting to fade. I was no longer carrying it around with me like a badge of shame. Sophie wasn't just a distraction from my past. She was the beginning of something new, something real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could see a future where I wasn't defined by the mistakes of others. I could be happy again. As my relationship with Sophie grew, my bond with Jason and Mark also strengthened. The honesty between us had become the foundation of a new kind of friendship, one built on trust, even after everything that had happened. It was strange, but in a way, what had nearly destroyed us had made us better. I wasn't the same person I had been before the betrayal, but I wasn't broken either. I was moving on, building a life that was better than the one I had left behind. As weeks passed, life began to take on a strange new normal. I had settled into my routine of co-parenting with Lisa, seeing Emily regularly, and balancing my growing relationship with Sophie. It felt surreal at times, how quickly everything had changed, and yet how I was finally starting to feel whole again. There were no more hidden secrets, no gnawing doubts. Things were clearer now, and I was more focused than ever on living my life the way I wanted to. The more I spent time with Sophie, the more I realized how different things were with her compared to what I had experienced with Lisa. With Sophie, there was an honesty and openness that had been missing for so long in my marriage. There were no pretenses, no underlying tension. We could talk for hours, and it never felt forced. I wasn't constantly second-guessing myself or worrying about what was going on behind the scenes. It was just easy. I had been cautious at first, afraid to jump into something too soon, but Sophie made it easy to take things one step at a time. She wasn't pressuring me into anything. In fact, we kept things casual for a while, not rushing into labels or big commitments. It was refreshing to let the relationship develop naturally without the weight of expectations. One night, we were sitting in her apartment, watching an old movie on the couch. I had my arm around her, and she was curled up beside me, the soft glow of the TV the only light in the room. It was one of those quiet, comfortable moments that felt perfect in its simplicity. "You seem different," Sophie said softly, breaking the silence. I glanced down at her, raising an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter," she replied, smiling. "Like a weight's been lifted off you since we first met. When we started talking, you seemed, I don't know, like there was a lot going on in your head. Now you seem more at peace." I thought about her words for a moment, realizing she was right. When I had first met Sophie, I was still carrying the weight of everything that had happened with Lisa, Jason, and Mark. But now, after months of rebuilding my life and focusing on myself, I did feel different. Lighter, like Sophie said. "Yeah," I admitted. "I guess I finally let go of a lot of stuff. I'm not carrying it around anymore." Sophie tilted her head, curious. "How did you do it? How did you move on from everything?" I shrugged, thinking about how to answer. "Honestly, I don't know. It wasn't like one moment where everything clicked. It was a lot of small steps. Talking things through with Jason and Mark helped. It wasn't easy, but I realized I didn't want to lose them as friends, even after everything that happened. It's weird, but I think being honest with each other, brutally honest, was what helped us get through it." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "And Lisa?" "Lisa's complicated," I said with a sigh. "We're not on bad terms, but we're not really friends either. I forgave her for what happened, but I can't go back to the way things were. We talked because of Emily, but that's it. And honestly, I'm okay with that. I think we both know it's better this way." Sophie reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm glad you found a way to move forward. You deserve that." I smiled, grateful for how understanding she was. Sophie never pushed me to open up, but when I did, she always listened, never judging me for how complicated my past was. Things with Sophie continued to grow naturally. We spent more time together, met each other's friends, and gradually became a bigger part of each other's lives. She even met Emily a few times during outings, and though I was nervous about introducing them at first, Sophie was great with her. She didn't try to force a bond, but she was kind and patient, letting things unfold in their own time. Seeing Emily smile when she was around Sophie gave me a sense of relief I hadn't realized I needed. But as my relationship with Sophie blossomed, something else surprising happened. I started hanging out with Jason and Mark more often than ever before. It was strange how the betrayal had brought us closer. I guess going through something that dark and twisted had a way of stripping down all the walls between us. There were no more pretenses, no more unspoken tension. We had laid everything out in the open, and now we could actually be real with each other. We didn't bring up the affair much anymore. It had become this unspoken part of our history, something that didn't need to be rehashed at every turn. I had made peace with what happened, and as crazy as it sounded, I didn't hold it against them. Lisa was out of the picture, and while what they did was wrong, it wasn't something that defined them anymore. One evening, Jason, Mark, and I met up for a drink at the bar we used to frequent. We hadn't done it in a while, but it felt good to sit around a table again, just like old times. The three of us laughed, caught up on work, and talked about life like nothing had changed. But deep down, we all knew we were different now. Better, in some weird way. After a few beers, Jason looked at me seriously, his expression sobering. "You know, Jack, I still can't believe how things turned out. I thought for sure we'd never get past what happened." Mark nodded, agreeing. "Yeah, I don't think I could have handled it the way you did, man. It takes a lot to forgive something like that." I shrugged, taking a sip of my drink. I don't know if it was forgiveness, really. I just didn't want to hold on to the anger. What happened, happened. There was no going back, so I figured, why waste the energy hating you guys when we could just move on? They both looked at me with a mix of respect and gratitude. We had been through the worst together, and somehow we had come out the other side stronger. Our friendship wasn't perfect, but it was more real than it had ever been. As we finished our drinks that night, I realized that I had truly found a new beginning. My old life had crumbled, but from the wreckage, I had built something better. I had stronger friendships, a healthier relationship with Sophie, and a future that wasn't tainted by the mistakes of the past. And for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. The weeks turned into months, and life kept moving forward. My relationship with Sophie was blossoming, and we were spending more time together, blending our lives in ways I hadn't thought possible after what had happened with Lisa. I had Emily with me on weekends, and Sophie made it easy for us to spend time as a little trio. She was great with Emily, patient, fun, and never overbearing. It felt natural, like Sophie had been part of our lives all along. One Saturday afternoon, I took Emily and Sophie to the park. It was one of those warm autumn days where the leaves were just starting to change, and the sunlight cast a golden glow over everything. Emily was running around, chasing a butterfly, while Sophie and I sat on a bench, watching her with smiles on our faces. "I've never seen her so happy," Sophie said, her voice soft. "She's such a sweet kid." "Yeah," I replied, pride swelling in my chest. "She's the best thing that ever happened to me." Sophie looked at me thoughtfully for a moment before speaking again. "You're a good dad, Jack. You've handled all of this with so much grace. Most people wouldn't have come through something like that with as much strength as you have." I chuckled, shaking my head. "I don't know about grace. There were plenty of times I wanted to give up, especially after, everything with Lisa and the guys. It was hard, but I think I just didn't want to let the past define me. I didn't want to be that guy who's bitter about life." Sophie reached over, resting her hand on mine. "You did more than that, though. You rebuilt your life, and you didn't do it by shutting people out. You let Jason and Mark back in, you embraced the messiness of it all, and you came out stronger." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. I had faced everything head on, and instead of cutting people out or letting the betrayal consume me, I had chosen to rebuild my life with honesty and vulnerability. It hadn't been easy, but here I was, sitting in the park with the woman I cared about and my daughter, living a life I never thought I'd have again. "Yeah, I guess I did," I said, squeezing her hand gently. "And I'm glad I did." Sophie smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder as we watched Emily play. In that moment, everything felt right. The chaos of the past seemed like a distant memory, and for the first time in a long time, I felt content. But despite the peace I had found, I knew there were still loose ends to tie up. One of those loose ends was Lisa. While we had been civil and co-parented without any major issues, there was still an underlying tension between us. We hadn't really talked about the affair since I left, and though I had moved on, there was still a part of me that wanted closure. I needed to have that final conversation to truly close the door on our chapter. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A few days later, I got a call from Lisa. It wasn't about Emily this time. Her voice was tense, as if she'd been thinking about something for a while and had finally worked up the nerve to talk about it. "Jack, can we meet?" she asked, her tone hesitant. I was caught off guard. We hadn't spoken outside of our usual parenting coordination in months. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. I think we need to talk," she said quietly. "About everything. I know we haven't really addressed what happened, and I feel like I owe you that." I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to revisit the past, but another part of me knew this was necessary. I needed to hear her side, to close that chapter for good. "Okay," I finally said. "Let's meet." We agreed to meet at a small cafe we used to go to when we first started dating, years before everything fell apart. It felt strange to return to a place that held so many memories, both good and bad. When I walked in, Lisa was already sitting at a table near the window, nursing a cup of coffee. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. It had been so long since we'd had a real conversation, and I wasn't sure where to begin. I sat down, and we both fumbled through awkward small talk for a few minutes before Lisa finally cut to the chase. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "About the affair, about everything that led to the end of our marriage. I've wanted to say this for a while, but I didn't know how. I know I hurt you, Jack, and I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I regret everything." I studied her face, trying to read her emotions. There was no trace of defensiveness or excuses, just raw honesty. For the first time, I saw a vulnerability in Lisa that I hadn't seen in years. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "But it wasn't just the affair that broke us. I think we were drifting apart long before that. The affair was just the thing that pushed us over the edge." Lisa nodded, her eyes downcast. I know. I could feel it too. We weren't the same people we were when we first got married. I think I just didn't want to admit it. And when things started falling apart instead of fixing them, I made things worse. There was a long pause between us as we both reflected on how far we had come since the collapse of our marriage. I didn't hate Lisa anymore, but I also knew that we were never meant to last. We had grown apart, and the affair had been a symptom of a much larger problem. I don't hate you, I said finally. I did for a while, but I've let go of that. I just want us to be good parents to Emily. That's what matters now. Lisa looked up at me, her eyes filled with relief. Thank you, Jack. That's all I want too. I want to make sure we're doing what's best for her. We sat there for a few more minutes, talking about Emily and how we could continue to co-parent in a way that was best for her. There were no lingering accusations, no heated arguments, just two people who had moved on from their past and were ready to focus on the future. When I left the cafe that day, I felt lighter. The final piece of closure I needed had fallen into place. I had forgiven Lisa, not for her sake, but for mine. It was the last step in truly moving on. And as I walked back to my car, I realized that the chapter of my life with Lisa was finally closed out that night. I told Sophie about the conversation and she listened, supportive as always. She didn't pry or push for details, but she understood how much that final conversation meant to me. You've really come full circle, she said, smiling as we sat on her couch later that night. I'm proud of you, Jack. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. I'm just glad it's finally behind me. As I held Sophie close that night, I knew without a doubt that I had found my way out of the wreckage of my past. My friendships with Jason and Mark were stronger than ever. My relationship with Sophie was growing into something real, and for the first time in years, I could see a future that wasn't weighed down by mistakes and regrets. I had built something new, something better, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. Life had a strange way of working out, even when it seemed like everything had fallen apart. As the weeks passed, that sense of closure I had been chasing finally settled in. My relationship with Sophie continued to grow, and the bond between us deepened with each day. She was patient, kind, and most importantly, she made me feel like I was rebuilding my life on solid ground, not on the shaky ruins of the past. Emily adored Sophie, and seeing them together made me realize just how much I had moved on from the chaos that had consumed my life a year ago. There was no longer any tension with Lisa. No unresolved anger toward Jason or Mark. Everything had found its place, and I had found mine. One Saturday, Sophie, Emily, and I decided to spend the day at the zoo. It was one of those rare, perfect days where the sun was shining, the air was crisp, and everything just felt right. As we wandered through the different animal exhibits, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of peace. Emily was laughing, running ahead to point out the giraffes, and Sophie was walking beside me, her hand in mine. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking over my shoulder or worrying about what might go wrong. I was simply enjoying the moment. After the zoo, we grabbed ice cream and sat in the park watching Emily play on the swings. Sophie leaned her head on my shoulder, and for a while we just sat there in comfortable silence. I think she's happy, Sophie said, glancing at Emily. I nodded, smiling. Yeah, she's a tough kid. She's been through a lot, but she's handling everything like a champ. Sophie lifted her head and looked at me thoughtfully. You know, I never told you this, but when I first met you, I could tell you were carrying something heavy. I didn't know what it was, but there was this weight. And now it's like you're a completely different person. I thought about that for a moment, realizing how true her words were. When I had first met Sophie, I was still knee-deep in the wreckage of my past, dealing with the fallout of Lisa's affair, trying to rebuild my friendships with Jason and Mark, and struggling to find my footing as a single dad. But now, sitting here with her, I could feel how much I had changed. I think I finally let go of all that baggage. It wasn't easy, but I realized that holding on to anger, resentment, or even just old memories wasn't helping me. I needed to let it all go. Sophie smiled, her eyes soft. I'm proud of you, Jack. You've come so far. We sat in silence for a little longer, watching Emily, and I realized just how right everything felt. The life I had once pictured, one with Lisa, Jason, and Mark in their original roles, was gone. But the life I had now, the one I had built from the ashes of that betrayal, was even better than I could have imagined. As my relationship with Sophie deepened, my friendships with Jason and Mark continued to grow in surprising ways. We didn't shy away from what had happened, but we also didn't let it define us. We'd been through something messy and painful, but in the end, it made us stronger. Our conversations were more open, more honest, and more real than they had ever been before. There were no more secrets, No more pretending. We had faced the darkest parts of our friendship. And somehow, we had come out the other side. One evening, we all met up at a small backyard BBQ at Mark's house. It was the first time in a long while that the three of us had gathered like this, with no awkwardness, no tension, just laughter, good food, and the kind of easy camaraderie that had always been the backbone of our friendship. As the night wore on and the drinks flowed, Jason raised his beer and looked at me with a grin. "To Jack," he said, raising his bottle high, "the most forgiving guy I know, and the only reason the three of us are still sitting here together." Mark raised his beer too, nodding in agreement. "Seriously, man, you've shown us what it means to move forward, even when everything's gone to hell. I don't think I could have done what you did." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Trust me, it wasn't easy. But honestly, I'm glad we went through it. We're better now, all of us." They both smiled, and I could see the gratitude in their eyes. We had been through something that could have torn us apart forever, but instead it had brought us closer. Our friendship wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was all that mattered. After the BBQ, as I drove home, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. The man I was now was so different from the man I had been when Lisa's affair first came to light. Back then I had felt lost, betrayed, and broken. But now, I had found a new sense of purpose, a new sense of self. Sophie had become an important part of my life, and while I didn't want to rush things, I could see a future with her, one filled with love, trust, and everything I had thought I'd lost. Emily was thriving, and she adored Sophie. My relationship with my daughter had only grown stronger, and I was proud of the father I had become. And as for Jason and Mark, our friendship had weathered the worst kind of storm, and somehow it had survived. We weren't just friends anymore. We were family. A messy, complicated family, but a family nonetheless. As I pulled into the driveway that night, I smiled to myself, knowing that I had built something new, something better. I had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and the crumbling of my old life, but I hadn't let it destroy me. Instead, I had rebuilt. And the life I had now, it was more than I had ever hoped for. I had moved on. I had found happiness again. And for the first time in a long time, I was truly at peace.